Hello and welcome to Thyros Web Development Tips and Tutorials. This video is a complete guide to all the available CSS Grid utility classes in Tailwind CSS. I will not just be using some colored boxes to explain the concepts here. Instead, we will learn how to implement real world layouts and also customize Tailwind CSS to help achieve some of them. Grid and flex are two of the most confusing concepts in CSS. I have covered Flexbox in the previous video. I highly recommend watching that first if you aren't very familiar with flex utilities. Now this video is for grid. If you already know the basics of CSS Grid, that's great. But even if you don't know much, this video will help you understand the concepts better. Grid is a method that allows you to lay out elements in a grid format, which means in two dimension. Unlike flex, which is helpful for placing elements in a single dimension. Grid is a lot like HTML tables with rows, columns, and cells, but with a lot more control when it comes to sizing, positioning, alignment, and responsiveness. Now let's start with the simplest grid layout of multiple rows and columns with equal width and height. We see such simple grid layouts every day on YouTube homepage like this, or your e-commerce websites like this, or your Instagram like this, and so on. So let's use our first set of Tailwind CSS utility classes for grid, which are grid, which sets the display property to grid, and then grid calls with a number. Now don't worry about the left side if you're not familiar with grid using pure CSS. Let's jump into practicals right away. We have one video div here. In the CSS, I've added some classes for video just so that it doesn't get cluttered here. So it has some padding, background color, shadow, and so on. Now let's make 5 more such divs, 5 more such video blocks. Assume there is a video in each of these divs. Okay, so we have totally 6 video items. Now let's turn this into a simple grid layout. So a grid layout is similar to flex. It needs at least 2 elements, one parent and one or more child elements. So to turn this into a grid, let's add the first class grid to the parent element. Now this does nothing because we will have to tell the browser how many columns, how many rows, and so on. That's where the next class, that is grid calls, comes into picture. So here, as you can see, you can use 1 to 12 columns in Tailwind CSS. Now let's say we know that we need 3 columns of equal width. So we will add grid calls 3. Isn't that simple? In pure CSS, for the same thing, you will have to write something like this. We use grid template columns and say repeat 3 and so on. We'll also break this down in a while. Now all these are stacked up too close to each other. We want some spacing in between, right? That's where the next utility class comes in. That is the gap utilities. Column gap, row gap, and gap in CSS. But in Tailwind, it's gap x, the number, gap y number, and just gap when you want it in both the directions. Let's see how this works. So to add a horizontal gap, let's do gap x 1, 2, 3, and so on. And for the vertical spacing, we could add gap y, maybe the same amount, 6. To add the same amount of gap for both horizontal and vertical, you could just keep it gap 6. Now the reason we're not seeing the same amount of spacing is something else, but trust me, it adds the exact amount of spacing. Alright, now next, let's make this responsive already. So on small screens, we don't want 3 columns, right? We just want 1 column. So let's say grid calls 1. And then as you move, maybe somewhere here at the SM breakpoint, let's say grid calls 2. Okay, this is not SM yet. Yeah, somewhere here. And then at MD breakpoint, let's make this grid calls 3. right? So that does it. All right, done. So this was about the simplest grid layout of equal width columns with equal sized items, which probably covers at least 25% of the use cases. Shall we try and understand what exactly is happening behind the scenes? This actually just one class we need to understand one of these grid calls 1, 2 or 3, right? So let's look at this. It uses this property grid template column. So if you're familiar with pure CSS and grid template columns, you might know that this takes in a variety number of values. I'm not going to go into all of that, but here what it does is it repeats it 3 times. So if you want the same value for all number of columns that you need, you can use this repeat function. So if you need 4 columns, it's repeat 4, repeat 5, 5 columns and so on. And here this is the width of each column in that grid, and that's again using a function min max, right? So it's 0 at the minimum and 1 fr stands for 1 fraction at the maximum. So here 1 fraction means all 3 are equal, as many number of n number of items, all of them are 1 by n width. That's at the maximum, which is why here it doesn't care about this gap. So the grid is invisible here, but actually the first grid ends here. This is where the first grid column ends. This is where the second grid column ends, and this is where the third grid columns end. This is all you need to know for now. So let's say we don't have this width. So this is what happens. Right, so now you see the gap. Remember I mentioned that you're not seeing the same gap? Yes, now you do see the exact same gap in between the rows and between the columns. All right, now to demonstrate the next set of concepts, let me remove all of the responsive functionality just for the sake of simplicity. And you remember when we had the width here, we had a specific width. Let me add it for just, let me add it for one item so that you notice this is where the grid column ends, but we have the item aligning to the left of the column, right? Now these alignments can be changed using justify items CSS property. This has the values start, end, center and stretch. And then the Tailwind equivalent is justify items start, justify items end and so on. So let's see this in action. So by default, this is justify items stretch. That's why you're seeing all of them are stretching. Instead, if we change this to justify items start, if we change this to justify items start, this is what you will see. We're not seeing any changes here because the width is fixed, but otherwise, this is what you will see. All the items will occupy as less space as required and then move to the start of the grid column horizontally. Now instead we change this to end. This is what you will see. Everything moves to the end, even the fixed width item. You make it center, everything centers, and then like I said, by default it's stretch. Okay, great. So this is about horizontal alignment. What about the vertical alignment? Right now, this is the height of the body. We don't have anything below that, but let's make this grid occupy full screen. How do we do that? Let me just add a min height screen to this, and you immediately notice that now the grid is occupying full screen and each row occupies half the space. Great. But even here, the vertical alignment of each div is such that it's at the top of each row, right? So that's again because we have limited the height. So if we remove this, this is what happens. Okay. So let me remove it for just one of this. And let's see how to change the alignment of the others. For this, the property used is align items. For horizontal, it was justify items, similar to flex, and for vertical alignments, it's align items. Again, so it takes the value start and center, baseline and stretch. The Tailwind equivalent is item start, items end and so on. We don't have the align keyword. Let's see this in action again. So let me add it here. Items start. So you notice that we have no height mentioned here. Again, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So item start, we don't have any height mentioned. So what it does is takes as less height as required for that block. Items end pushes everything to the bottom of the row. Items center makes sure that the items are in the center of each row. Item stretch was the default. That's what you saw at the beginning when we didn't add this. And then there's something called items baseline. Though it looks almost like item start, there's a little difference. To demonstrate that to you, let me remove all these classes here. And this is just simple text. It doesn't have any padding or height or anything. And now this is what items baseline does. But if we change this to items start, you notice it just aligns at the top of the div. But what baseline does, it aligns it along the text at the base of the text of other grid items. This is very nice when you have to align some images and some text in between. You don't want the text floating to the entire top, correct? Now let me change this back to item center and I'll also add the video. Or what I'll do is I'll remove all of this entirely so that we can move on to the next set of concepts. Great. So in case you wondered, how do I make these two come together, right? Because no matter what you try to do with align items, they are far apart. So far with justify items and align items, we saw how to align these items horizontally and vertically within the grid cells, correct? Now let's see how to align the cells itself within the grid. Okay, this might sound confusing at the beginning, but with a little practice, you will understand what the difference is. So this can be done. The horizontal alignment of the grid cells themselves can be done using the justify content CSS properties. Not justify items, but justify content. So this has quite a few similar values like start, end, and center. There is no stretch here, but instead there is space between, space around, and space evenly. We'll see what that is with the Tailwind equivalent utilities, which is just justify start, justify end. So there is no justify items here and there's no content also. It's just justify start, justify end. Let's see this in action. But this is not a good example for you to see this property in action because this grid calls 3 that we have, it makes sure that no matter what, each grid column is one fraction in width, right? So these properties don't apply when the width is one fraction each. Instead, let's make some change here. So instead of grid calls 3, let me add another class. So let me say just grid custom. And here I have already added this class here, grid custom. Everything is same, grid template columns, repeat 3 min max. The only change I've made is I have replaced one FR with max content. So what it does is this. Yeah, you can already see the result here. It just occupies the maximum content that is within this. So in case we have a bigger text here, so something like video is here, you see it doesn't wrap the text. It just occupies as much width as required. So that's what max content does. Let me leave it as it is for the demonstration. So you know, right, if we make this 1 FR, it just occupies one fraction each. Now let's try out our justify content properties. So the classes are justify start, which seems to be the default. That's why you don't see any change here. Let's try out justify end. So you see this is different from justify items. In justify items, what happened was the items shifted within that much space. But here you notice the whole grid itself shifted to the end. The same thing with justify center. Then comes justify between. So you see, similar to flex and similar to flex, there's as much space in between as possible. Justify evenly, it distributes the space within, between and around the elements evenly. And the same thing if you change it to justify around, it divides the space in such a way that you get more space between than around. So sometimes this is helpful. Let's leave this at justify center for now. And just in case you're wondering, how do we get these two together? Because this gap looks really bad. That's where the next set of properties come. And if you have guessed it, it's not instead of justify content, because this is for the horizontal direction, it's align content, which is for the vertical direction. So this again has the same set of values, center, start, end, and so on. And the Tailwind equivalent is, again, we don't have the align keyword, it's just content start, content center, and so on. Let's look at the demo. So when you make it content center, or the whole grid comes in the center, right? It occupies as less space as possible. Content start does this, everything shifts up. Content end, everything shifts down. Content between, this is what it does, it gives as much space in between as possible. Content evenly, like we saw with justify evenly, it distributes the heights equally between and around the elements. Then content around again gives double the space here compared to what's around. I know all of these will be confusing at the beginning. You don't know what to use when. Yes, that happens. So in the beginning, don't bang your head too much. Just try, if you want everything in the center, just try both justify center and content center. Whichever works, it works for you. Just stick with that. Slowly you will understand the concepts. Great, so let's revise. We saw the grid class, which is added to the parent element to convert the layout into grid. Then we saw that we have number of utilities like grid calls 1, 2, 3 up to 12, which what it does is it creates equal width columns. There's a similar one that is grid rows 1 to 12, which also can be used. I just didn't demonstrate that here, but you can try it out on your own. Then you saw the gap utility classes for horizontal, vertical, and overall gap. Then we saw these justify items, start, end, center, and stretch for horizontal alignment of items within the grid cells. Then the same thing for vertical alignment within the grid cells, which is items start, items end, and so on. Then we saw the justify content, which Tailwind equivalent is just justify start, justify end. This is for the alignment of the whole grid itself. And then we saw the content center, content start for the content alignment in the vertical direction. Next, as I mentioned already, some of the use cases are the YouTube videos that you saw in the grid format, e-commerce, Instagram, but there are some more which I would like to show. So if you want to achieve something like this, the pricing section of a website, so here it uses equal width columns, so you can simply use grid calls 3 and achieve something like this. Yes, this is responsive as well. This is on CodePen. It's not mine. It's taken from, it's picked up from CodePen. The link is given in the description below. So this is not done using Tailwind. So you see, this is what grid calls will do for you. And then after the SM breakpoint is where grid calls 3 can be used. Until then, it's grid calls 1. But did you notice something? The advanced membership was the third on larger screens, but on mobiles, that came first. Now, something like this is very difficult to do using float or any other layout type. Yes, with Flex it's easy, and then with Grid you will notice that it's even more easier. So advanced comes first, basic comes next, and then comes free, while here it's the reverse, right? Free and basic and then advanced. Now let's see how to do that using Grid. I'll use the same code, only thing is I'll remove these three and I'll say free, basic and advanced, but let's start with the mobile layout, and of course I'll make this grid calls 3, remove all of this and all of this as well, grid calls 3, but only at SM breakpoint. Until then it's grid calls 1. Okay, and if you need an overall padding you can again add that right here, p6 maybe, yeah. But here on mobile, since we saw advanced first, let me add that first actually in the HTML itself, advanced, basic and free. So this is the mobile layout. Great. So what about on larger screens? We want advanced to come here, correct? Very similar to Flex, you can use the order classes. For this item, just say order 3. That's gone there. We want basic next, so you can say order 2. Right? This is how it is. We have free, basic, advanced, or you can even do order last for this one. Remove this and say order first. That does the same thing. That's just your preference. Here is a blog layout. It's some blog posts arranged in a grid layout. This is very simple. You just have to do grid calls to and grid rows to. If you don't need to mention the rows, if you don't know how many rows, just add grid calls to and leave it at that. And how many ever items you add, they just keep coming one below the other. You can try this out on your own. Let's see another example next. Look at this page. The moment you look at it, it might not look like a grid to you, but if you notice deeply, this is just one column here, this is another column here, but this column is twice the width of this column, and there's just one single row here. That's okay, but it's very easy to create something like this using the grid layout. So let's see how to do that using Tailwind. Let's just add 2 divs. Let me copy all of this. This is getting copied too. Let me just copy this one for now. This is a H1. Alright, so I've just added some classes to make it look neater. Let's skip the second heading and paragraph. I'll tell you later why. And now instead, let's add this div that had some actions, okay? So let's just say actions and then actions, probably a H2. I'm not going to style this too much for now, and just some links here. I'll just say link 1, link 2 and link 3. Let me just add some background, BG gray 50 or BG gray 100, and then some rounded corners. Okay, of course some padding. Great. Now if we turn this into a grid layout by saying grid and grid calls 2, because we have 2 columns, this is what happens. So it divides it into 2 equal width columns, and we don't want that. To change that, you can either create a custom class like grid template columns, and instead of saying repeat to whatever, you can say 2fr space 1fr. So what it does is it creates the first column with 2 fractions width and the third one with 1 fraction width. But we don't want to use custom classes because there's another way to do that using Tailwind. Now instead of saying grid calls 2, let's say grid calls 3. And there is a third grid here, third grid column here. We just have to move this here and expand this to occupy both the columns. Actually, not too complicated at all. simply add a class to this saying call span 2. Okay, that we're just saying this column to span 2 columns. That's it. You have the spanning 2 columns. Now we only have to add a little gap, and we can add a gap x of 6, and you have it. Great. So this is how you can make use of the Tailwind utility classes. You don't have to create custom classes for achieving widths that are like double or triple the amount of other columns. Instead, you can simply use the call span utility classes. Now this layout is not just this much. We could achieve something like this easily, but let's look at it. Let's make this responsive. Did you see what happened? Now, in smaller screens, we have this first para here, then come these two blocks, and then we have the next para here. On slightly larger mobiles, look at this. We have these two stacking next to each other, not one below the other, but next to each other. So this in itself is a grid layout. And this is another row. So right now what you see here is actually a grid with 3 rows and 2 columns. Do you see that? Yes. And when you go to larger screens, now you see again a grid layout with 3 columns like we created before, just that the first item spans across 2 columns. Shall we now try and implement this? So let's try and implement the mobile screen first. So we have something similar, actions and then related stuff. So I'll create another div. For now, let me just remove this. And let me add another div where we have that second heading and paragraph. I'll copy this. Okay, so we have something almost similar, just that we have to add a grid with grid calls 1, so that we can add a gap of 6, or let me make it gap y6. I'll have to remove this call span 2 here. Now this is almost what we need, but on slightly larger screen. So maybe at SM breakpoint, what we want is we want these two next to each other. There are multiple ways to do this, but what I would like to do is add these two within another parent div. So we have a grid nested inside another grid. So we give this parent also a grid layout and say grid calls 1 because that's what we need at mobile, but at SM breakpoint we need grid calls 2. Okay, so we have this stacking next to each other. Let's give this also a gap. So gap x 4, or let's make it 6 and make it even. And this also I'll add only at SM breakpoint. This is great. Now what about MD breakpoint? We want this to shift entirely to the right. How do we do that? So at MD breakpoint, we don't have grid calls 1. Instead, we have grid calls 3, but this is what it does. Let's solve one problem at a time, and we will make this come one below the other. To do that, at MD breakpoint, let's say grid calls 1 again, and let's remove that gap 0, so that at MD breakpoint, this is what happens. So you notice this is stretching because by default the content stretches. So let's change that by adding at MD breakpoint. Let's say content start, so that aligns the content at the start. Of course, at MD breakpoint we also need a vertical gap, so gap y of 6. This fixes that problem. Great. But what about making sure this comes down below this? First, let's make let's add a call span 2 to the first div, and we need that only at MD breakpoint. So MD call span 2. All right, so we already have that solved. Let's also add a call span 2 to this one. So that's also solved. Now, the only thing we need to do is we should remove this gap. We should somehow bring it up, right? And actually, that's quite simple. The way we did call span 2 here, we need to add row span 2 for this, because right now it's occupying the first row in the grid, right? So here at MD breakpoint, we just say row span 2. That's it. So it's spanning across 2 rows. So this whole grid was occupying 2 rows before, because we made this call span 2 and there was no space for this. This went into the second row. And that's why it was starting from here. Now that we did row span 2, this occupies both the rows, and which makes which makes this cell occupy only this much height, and this comes below. Isn't the grid layout so helpful? Now, I didn't achieve this in just one go. I kept trying different ways of doing this, and with practice you will be able to do this soon, because grid is actually complex. Great. Now let's move on to another example. Are you ready? I hope you are. Look at this web page. Similar to what we did in the previous example, here, if you make this responsive, you see that the mobile comes first, whereas in the larger layout, this mobile was in the center. Here, both the other divs come one below the other. In slightly larger screens, this is what you see. The mobile is on the left, and these two occupy both the columns here. So this occupies one column, and these two divs occupy both the columns. And here what happens is this comes here, the mobile comes at the center, and this div comes to the right. Shall we try and implement this? It's not going to be very hard after the previous example, right? So let me copy the link of this image. So copy image location, div, let me paste that image here. Then we have two more divs with the features. So let me copy feature 1, 2, and 3. I'll just add some BR tags, please don't mind. Okay, and I will just copy paste this once again, change this to 4, 5, and 6. Right, so this is almost what we have on small screens. Don't mind the other styling right here, the spacing and everything, that can be easily added. So now let's add a parent element to this entire content here. So that's a div. Alright, so let me add the grid class first, and then say grid calls 1, because that's what we want at the for the mobile screen. Then at the SM breakpoint, what we saw was the mobile was here, but these two divs shifted right here. For that, let's say at SM breakpoint, I want grid calls 2. This is what it does. Like we saw in the previous example, this can be easily fixed when you give a row span to this image here. So let me say at SM breakpoint, row span 2. What it does is it makes this cell shift right up here. There are 2 cells again here, but this is spanning across both the rows. Great. Next, of course, if you want some alignment, let's also do that. SM, since it's horizontal alignment of items within the cells, it's justify items center. You can also use content center and see what happens. Nothing happens, right? So let's just use justify item center. Okay. Slowly at MD breakpoint, what happens is we see this in the center, the first div on the left and the third one on the right. So first what we do is at MD breakpoint, let's make this grid calls 3. This solves most of our problems. We only have to add this here and this here. For that, like we saw, there is an order property which can be added here. So let's say at MD breakpoint, order first. That's it. Just that this is right aligned, so which can be easily achieved again. Just say MD text right. Okay, this is what you see, correct? Now we want these to be center aligned, right? Like you see here. Now that can be done, but first we need to remove this row span 2 for MD breakpoint. Don't forget that, otherwise we won't be able to achieve this in any way. So make this row span 1, and then to the parent container, you just have to add either item center or content center. If you don't know which one, just try both. Let me try item center first. Yeah, that works. That's because we are aligning the item within the grid cell to the center. Okay, how did you find this example? I found it amazing. This is a great usage of grid, right? I hope you're learning a lot. Now, before we proceed into the next example, I have some more utility classes to cover without any demo. So I'll just be running through the theory for the next 1 minute. So in regular CSS, there's something called as the place content property, which is the combination of justify content and align content. So if you want to horizontally and vertically center the grid content, you can simply use place content instead of two different CSS properties and values. So the equivalent in Tailwind is place content center, place content start. So whenever we say place content start, it means it's the combination of both the classes content start and items start. Okay, very similar to this is the place items property, and again this is similar. This is the combination of align items and justify items. So when you want the same value for both horizontal and vertical, instead of using two classes, you can use one single class. Also, we can align horizontally or vertically individual grid items by using justify self. So this is for horizontal alignment. The Tailwind equivalent is this, justify self auto, and so on. And then for vertical alignment, you have align self, align auto. Again, the align keyword is skipped. It's just self auto, self start for the vertical one. Then place self is the combination of align self and justify self. I just wanted to cover this because these properties and classes exist just in case you want to make use of them. Once again, let's revise what we learned. We saw the order property and we saw the Tailwind equivalent. So order first is actually just setting the order property to 9999, and order last is setting it to the negative value 9999. In Tailwind, you can just forget about the value and directly set order first, and you will know for sure that it's going to take the first position. Then we also saw call span 2, row span 2, 3, 4, whatever values you can use. Up to 12, you can also use call span full. Same goes with row span. If you notice, the regular CSS syntax is quite confusing, but in Tailwind you can simply use these and be sure. Let's come back to this example and I want to show you something. For some reason, now let's reduce this image opacity to 10. Okay, and for some reason I want this whole div to span across two columns but also overlap on this image. So I don't want any change in these two divs, just that I want this div to overlap on this. This is not possible using flex. This is not possible using float or any other layout. This is only possible using position absolute, but grid helps you achieve something like this. So before I start with that, I want you to know something called as grid lines exist. So we don't see these invisible grid lines in between the rows and columns, but they are called grid lines. This is the column line 1, line 2, line 3 and line 4, and same with rows. So line row 1 and this is like the row line 2. So if you want a particular item to start at a column and start at a row, specific one, you can use the row start and call start utility classes. So in this case, I want this to start at 1. So let me add call start 1 here, and I have to add the MD breakpoint at everything or it might not work properly. And then I can either say call span 2 or I can say call end 2, call end 3, because this is the line 3, right? If I say call end 2, it's this. So I want to say call end 3 because this is the line 3. I'll leave it at this. I also want to say that it starts at the first row, so not at the second. It starts at the first line, row start 1. But now the image and this div move downwards. I don't want this. I want the image to go back here. So what I do is at the MD breakpoint, I say call start to itself. Now it shifted down. It just tries to arrange to make sure that it doesn't overlap. But if you want to force it overlap, you'll say MD call MD row start 1. Okay, so you see even this is possible. So you can use the call span row span utilities, but at the same time you can also use these start and end utilities for row and columns for a little more control. This is great. We have covered almost 80% of the concepts. We are just left with something called as auto rows and auto columns. To demonstrate that, I have taken a random 8 images from placeimage.com. So far we saw that when we set grid calls 3, we set the number of columns. The grid takes up as many rows as required for the items. Say for example, now for this parent, let's add the grid class and say grid calls 3. This is what we saw, right? It occupies 3 columns and as many number of rows required. So if you add 2 more images here, we get another additional row. But what if we want to set the number of rows and then let it take as many columns as it wants? To do that, there's something called, let's remove this, there's something known as the grid autoflow. So by default, it's grid flow row, that's what you see. But when you change it to grid flow column, it first fills up the rows and then goes into the columns. So initially it just went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 like that, right? But here it does the opposite. So let me demonstrate it a little deeper for you. Grid flow call and then I say grid rows 2. So this is what it does. This was the second image. So this is that image. If you want, I can just change it and show. Yeah, so this is that image. So it first starts filling up as many rows there are and then moves into the columns. If we change this to grid rows 3, this is what we see. Grid rows 4, this is what happens. So if you want to change the flow, this is what you do. Now here, let me go back to grid rows 3. Now there's something else I want to demonstrate to you, for which I will change this back to grid calls 3 and remove this. So it's grid flow call, or let me say grid flow row. And now I want to add some call span 2 to some of the images. So let's say call span 2 here, call span 2 here, and call span 2 to this as well. So now do you notice we have a little gap here, and that's not what we want. This is happening because it's following the default order. This is the first image, second one, third, and since there's no space for the fourth one, which is spanning across 2, it just shifts to the bottom. So how do we remove this particular gap? So instead of adding grid flow row, we can change this to grid flow row dense. So the moment I did this, did you notice the image that was here shifted up and it just occupies all the space that is available. That's also possible with grid flow call tense. It just works the same way but for columns. So with something like this call span and the grid flow, you can create beautiful masonry layouts, something like this with images. So let's say you add like so many more images, and randomly you can say call span, even say call span 3 as well, and see what this looks like, right? So this is what it does. You can use this for a gallery, and of course if you want some gap, you can add some gaps as well. All right, so this is great. I think we have covered a lot of concepts in this one single tutorial. I'm sure you cannot digest everything at once unless you knew some great concepts already. If this is the first time for you, I hope you don't get overwhelmed with this. Take it step by step. First, just start start with some examples which just have fixed columns like 2 columns, 3 or 4 columns, and then slowly start learning the vertical alignment, horizontal alignment, and then about spanning and order, and then the auto flow. All right, so good luck. Thank you for watching. This was a very difficult video for me to create. I had to learn grid for a lot many hours and then try to simplify it. So do share this video if you loved it and learned a lot. Thank you for watching. Hit a like and share this video ahead. If you enjoyed watching this, don't forget to subscribe below and turn on the notifications so you won't miss a single video from Tyrus.